Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to this IFS Annual Lecture. I'm Paul Johnson, Director of the IFS, and I'm really delighted to welcome you and, of course, welcome our speaker to this evening's event. I'm sad, of course, that we can't do this face-to-face. This will be the first, obviously, of our annual lectures that has been presented in this way, but as compensation for that, we really do have a hugely distinguished speaker this evening, and one who I know has some extraordinarily interesting things to say. Over the last few years, we've had a number of very eminent academics and people working in the public policy field, but none more so than tonight's speaker, Lord Gus O'Donnell, who many of you will know was Cabinet Secretary between 2005 and 2011. Before that, he was Permanent Secretary to the Treasury. He's now Chairman of Frontier Economics, among a number of other roles that he has, one of which, the most important of which, is that he is President of the Institute for Fiscal Studies. Gus has a very distinguished career in public service, but also he has very much always made it clear that he is at heart a social scientist and an economist, and has been a great supporter of social science, of evidence-based policy making, and of the use of economics in public policy. Tonight, he's going to talk about the way in which the government has responded to the current crisis, and as you'll see from the title, in particular, the role of evidence and science, the sciences, the social sciences, as well as the hard sciences in dealing with that. I won't say more by way of introduction. You all should have a link to Slido if you want to ask questions. Do put questions on there, and you can vote for other people's questions to take them to the top of the list. Gus will speak for about 40 minutes, which should leave us with about 20 minutes for a question and answer session at the end. But with no further ado, it's my huge pleasure and privilege to welcome Gus O'Donnell to give this lecture. Thank you very much.
Paul, thank you for that extremely generous and far too generous, actually, introduction. I'm delighted to be here. Really sad that we can't be together in person, but I hope that we can talk and have a good conversation at the end of this lecture. But let me start by telling you what I want to do. First of all, I want to look at ways of assessing the government's performance in handling the coronavirus pandemic. I think in some ways it's too early to make clear judgments on the UK record, and I do not intend to engage in trial by hindsight. There was a time when a sentence starting, "I'm not an epidemiologist," but was a signal that the person should actually stop talking. I hope I don't fall into that category. I'll be trying to stick to things that I know about. The primary intention is to use various ways of assessing performance to inform how we can conduct the next stage of the crisis. And I should start by expressing my sincere thanks to the work of all frontline staff who have made incredible sacrifices to treat patients, to help minimize the spread of the virus and the death toll, and to cope with lockdowns in their various forms. In addition, there are many public and civil servants who've worked tirelessly in many ways to make a real difference to people's lives. My main concern is whether the right questions were asked at the right times and whether the appropriate structures were in place to ensure that the best possible decisions were made given the considerable uncertainties. If I have one take home, it's this. The government lacks, and it still lacks, a policy framework that can properly assess the costs and benefits of different measures. This is in part because the medical sciences have informed strategy far more than of various other branches of science. A vital adjustment is needed now, or the government will find itself forever stuck between a rock and a hard place. But first, Let's start by looking at the facts behind our performance in dealing with the crisis. I believe the best way of assessing our record is to look at, and here I'm going to put up my first slide, the excess mortality rates. This slide shows you the level of excess deaths experienced in the UK compared to some other countries. And it's thanks to some excellent work that's been done by John Byrne-Murdoch at the Financial Times. And you'll see there excess deaths at 45% for the UK. Pretty staggering stuff. Many will argue this is because we locked down too late. Others will say it reflects London's place as an international hub. But decisions like discharging elderly patients from hospitals into care homes without testing should also be scrutinised. In time, we will learn how much weight to give to each of those factors. The next slide shows the fall in GDP compared to 5 other major economies. I include this data, I have to put this out, because so many people think of GDP as a success measure. But it's quite clear if you do take that view, then there was a much bigger fall, certainly across this period, in the UK than anywhere else. There's, to my mind, a rather sterile debate about whether the recovery will be of a V or U shape or some other letter. Either way, there will be a long-run loss of output that may not be recovered for many, many years. But this is a really bad time to be using GDP as a measure of our economic success. As Eben Davies put it on the BBC's PM programme, and I quote, "Measuring GDP at a time like this is like measuring a patient's cholesterol after he's been hit by a bus. The hugs you aren't getting, the volunteering you're giving, the social capital that you're building, none of these feature in GDP." So the decline in GDP really reflects government decisions to close down parts of the economy, thereby enforcing reduced consumption. It's likely that a recession effectively induced by government will be very different from other recessions. So you need to be careful about comparisons. I prefer to look at the pandemic's overall impact by looking at how people assess their own individual well-being. Look at this slide. Since the ONS began collecting data in 2011 under the coalition government, and I had something to do with this, this shows us that basically well-being fell quite dramatically. If you look at the answers to the questions on life satisfaction, overall, is your life worthwhile? Your happiness levels all showed big drops. And the anxiety figure, the numbers on anxiety, which is the right-hand axis, showed a big increase. Now, these are very large changes. The only comparable event for numbers to change by this sort of magnitude was the collapse in well-being in Greece in the wake of the 2008 crisis and the crippling choices that that country had to make. So, were we particularly bad? Look at the comparison across other countries. And here we've shown, because international comparisons are difficult, the amount they've changed. And again, the UK, it is surprising to me that countries that have been affected so much by the pandemic, like Spain and Italy, have seen very small reductions in well-being. And I do not know why that is, before you ask me. These figures, though, refer to averages, and they hide differences between groups. Research has highlighted that in the UK and US, those in more precarious jobs have been more likely to be out of work due to the virus, and the impact on women has been more severe. In Germany, meanwhile, neither your gender nor level of education are predictors of job security. The IFS has also documented some of the distributional impacts in the UK. The next slide shows that younger people, particularly women, are much more likely to work in shutdown sectors. So the distributional impacts are really quite dramatic. The IFS work has shown that in general, the virus has affected poorer groups much harder in all three dimensions: health, economy, and well-being. And there are also significant distributional differences between men and women, and has been highlighted frequently but needs repeating between different ethnic groups. One other particularly worrying change is the effect on children. The pandemic is at risk of reversing many of the hard-earned gains in closing gaps in educational outcomes between rich and poor students. These results should feature very large in the government's mind when in the next few months it considers measures to support workers beyond the furlough scheme. And I'll come back to the new measures announced today. In my mind, ministers would do well to use these well-being metrics much more systematically in assessing the costs and benefits of future policy choices. So it's quite clear we've done badly. Why? What might explain that poor performance? And remember, just last year, in 2019, the UK was ranked second for pandemic preparedness by the Global Health Security Index. Now, who do you think was the most prepared? And please don't laugh, the United States. So that's odd. As for state capacity, if you look at the indices, international indices on the qualities of civil service, best one done by the Blackney School, we were ranked as the best in the world. And that's the most comprehensive assessment we have available. So while we don't have the kind of data that a future government inquiry would have, we can nonetheless sketch out the issues that need to be considered and I hope to put forward some hypotheses that should be tested to see why it was we did so badly. My experience with handling crises tells me that the following factors are absolutely crucial. First, collecting the right evidence. Secondly, the structures and processes, drawing on experts across different disciplines and incorporating the views of the practitioners, the implementers, and the communities that are actually living with the experience of the crisis. Thirdly, strong political leadership. You need a strategic plan, you need to make timely decisions, and you need to communicate them clearly. And fourth, institutions capable of implementing decisions effectively. So let's take those in turn. Collecting evidence. Rapidly collecting the right evidence was brought home to me during the 2008 global financial crisis. We had a lot of data, but it was fundamentally flawed. I was shocked by how little the experts, in this case the banks, really knew. The solution was to work out what evidence we needed and then to either generate it or collect it. This phase of crisis management has to come first, and it requires quite a lot of central control. And that was particularly true of the global financial crisis because you're dealing with a relatively small number of banks. But this sort of crisis requires a collaboration of multiple local bodies. We had in the UK a centralised Public Health England, coupled with the strength and size of the National Health Service, that should have given us an advantage over decentralised countries that use more private provision in getting this central data. And in the ONS, the Office for National Statistics, we have one of the world's best statistics agencies. So why didn't we begin random testing earlier? The modelers must have known this was absolutely vital for getting the right data. And in the ONS, we are now up and running with excellent data provided by such randomized modeling. The best models that we've seen, those EPI models, are also based on numerous behavioral assumptions. So devising ways of monitoring behavioral assumptions should also have been an early task. There's no doubt that little was known about the virus at its early stages, but by the end of January, ministers had enough information to know that a storm might be coming. We also had a small advantage of a few weeks in being able to learn from other countries. It's not yet clear how far such learning took place. We were able to establish certain key facts, for example, the great variations in the impact of the virus depending on age. Young people are far, far less at risk. Taking this consideration to its logical conclusion, Andrew Oswald and his colleagues at Warwick were recommending that the lockdown should be confined to those above a certain age, given the enhanced health risks they faced and the social and economic consequences of closing schools. All of this suggests that the failure to ramp up testing and tracing much earlier was important. There is a legitimate argument that our testing systems were not ready, but this excuse does not apply to tracing, which requires a relatively low-tech set of measures to ramp up. Failures in tracing and tracking and testing may now lead to the breakdown of a central pillar of the government response. There also seems to be a clear medical consensus that we should be carrying out far more tests to ensure those with the virus do not spread it as much. I cannot help to emphasize one area in terms of evidence where the UK is in a good position. The ONS has been collecting wellbeing data, as I mentioned, since 2011, which should allow us to monitor how the virus and varying degrees of lockdown are affecting people's well-being with a good degree of accuracy in terms of spatial accuracy, because the sample sizes are so large. Since the virus has health, social, and economic impacts, measures like well-being are particularly useful, and the government should have made more use of this excellent data in deciding its responses. So structures and processes. This is where I think the government made some key errors. All the attention was focused on SAGE, providing expert advice to allow ministers to say they were, and I quote, following the science. My experience with SAGE-like bodies was they are extremely useful in answering specific questions. The early makeup of SAGE was dominated by medical professionals. Therefore, they were probably expert at answering questions specific to the medical sciences. But this is a mixed crisis involving health, economic, and social factors. Medical scientists had certain priors, for example, that the coronavirus would be experienced as a flu-like wave. SAGE does not seem to have been willing early on to investigate alternative suppression measures, which were successful in places like South Korea. Its work also appears to be laced with assumptions about human behavior. The size and expertise of SAGE has since expanded, and collectively, the various SAGE groups now number over 200 experts, which, if anything, in my mind, is rather too large. To contain the virus, you needed to know the impact of each lockdown measure on the spread of the disease, but you also wanted to know the other effects of such measures. For example, closing schools is a step that carries profound consequences. It affects the quality of education. It has huge impacts on teachers and parents who are trying to work from home, and it affects the well-being of children deprived of social interaction and learning. So multiple analytical approaches need to feed into such advice as goes to ministers, and ministers need guidance about the trade-offs that are involved, as well as how to make consistent decisions as part of an overarching strategy. So how can politicians decide on the right mix of policies when they're not actually presented with the costs and benefits of each measure? The answer is these are tough choices, and they will inevitably be made with very limited information. Officials can help by spelling out the costs and benefits of each measure, accepting that all the estimates are somewhat uncertain. But to do so effectively, to actually make decisions and trade-offs, you need some form of common currency, which can be used to help decide on the inevitable trade-offs. Richard Layard et al., as they say in the academic world, and I am one of the al, laid out a framework for handling such decisions based around impacts on subjective well-beings. That paper was published some months ago. One stark result of this early work was to show that the lockdown measures appeared to be consistent with the government placing an extremely high value on extra years of life, considerably in excess of the figures usually used by the Treasury in its Green Book and the NHS, as in NICE, when they use quality adjusted life years. I don't know what the right answers are, but we are not being consistent. I think this is one of the consequences of SAGE's focus on the medical aspects and of the pandemic response. I hope we discover that there was a higher committee that gratefully received SAGE's work and then brought it together in a broader framework to make for sensible decision making. It's clear that COBRA can run that role effectively. And it doesn't help that SAGE was originally shrouded in mystery, nor that the UK lacks an independent scientific knowledge centre. My biggest fear, though, is that no such framework exists. So the government was not able to give a value of years of life saved by lockdown measures versus other values. My guess is the main learning from this crisis will be the need to establish such a framework. Another way of thinking about this is to ask, what was the government's strategy on COVID as opposed to its tactics? And remember, a prime minister who has won the EU referendum and a general election understands the benefits of having a clear strategy. I hope we are now at a point where such a strategy can be made clearer, both for policymakers and for the public to understand. To direct such a strategy, you need an executive committee structure that can critically assess the enormous amounts of data and opinion being directed at it. In my experience, one of the best ways of doing this, when you've got numerous departments involved, numerous experts, is the National Security Council that was set up by the coalition government in 2010, the NSC as it's known. It involved senior officials and experts explaining the nature of the particular challenge, be it a defence or security challenge, their reasoning as to what decisions are required, and the evidence base on which they were operating. Then the politicians, the various ministers, would cross-examine those experts to test the evidence and the recommendations. They would debate the issues, and all of this before coming to their political decisions. They would do this in the committee, which allowed the officials and the experts to understand the political factors that have influenced their final decisions. In the early days of the virus, COBRA meetings were called, and COBRA meetings, in my experience, are very useful for short-term crises. There was a political advantage in bringing in the heads of the devolved nations, but a longer-term crisis, like the one we now face, requires a structure more like the NSC. At present, the government has two key committees. One to look at strategy, chaired by the Prime Minister, and one to ensure implementation of that strategy, chaired by Michael Gove. Personally, I'd have one meeting in order to minimise the risk of slippage between strategy and delivery. But the structures matter. But in the end, you also need effective political leadership. So I've established that the government has sufficient information to allow it to make better preparations during the crucial period from mid-January onwards. Ultimately, only an independent inquiry will allow us to reach a full conclusion on whether, as a government spokesman put it, and I quote, the government always had the right steps at the right time, guided by scientific evidence, unquote. From the 23rd of March, the government's message, as you can see on this slide, was stay home, protect the NHS, save lives. The problem was the campaign attached to the simple slogan had some adverse consequences. Conformity and approval of the lockdown was remarkably high, and the guidance even brought a spike in self-reported well-being. Yet this also led some people to stay at home who probably should have sought out medical help. The NHS was protected, but by diverting resources from other health issues to COVID. The net impact of all of that is still unclear, which is why the use of excess deaths is probably a sensible outcome measure, Perhaps predictably, the government chose in its daily press conferences to emphasize the direct COVID effects. Even here, there were problems that relate back to the absence of a good evidence base. Classic example of daily slides, right? Showing hospital deaths, but this was misleading as many were taking place in care homes. The data on new cases to this day remains problematic as the level of testing keeps changing. Attention focused on the R number, but a single national average was always going to be of limited value. A sympathetic read of this data, of the way in which they were presented, is that this was for ease of public understanding. However, Sir David Norgrove of the UK Statistics Authority put it more critically to Matt Hancock, Secretary of State for Health, on the 2nd of June, where he stated that, and I quote, this is with respect to the way the data on numbers of tests was displayed, the aim seems to be to show the largest possible number of tests, even at the expense of understanding. More generally, politicians got themselves into the bind of trying to achieve better outcomes according to the more publicly salient rather than the scientifically thought through metrics. We'll need to explore how far these biases towards the direct COVID effects led to poor decisions. Politically, you can understand the objective of avoiding pictures of hospitals being overrun with no space for COVID patients. The indirect effects were always going to be less visible and less newsworthy. The result was that the virus trumped all other concerns for the public, who out of some combination of national solidarity and fear, abided by the rules at remarkably high rates. And the Prime Minister played his part, being taken into intensive care. That demonstrated that the virus could affect anyone, and it reinforced certain misconceptions. Polling in May showed that people put their chances of being hospitalized if they caught COVID at 40%. That's the median guess. The real rate is, of course, far, far lower. The public communication of risk is always going to involve trade-offs, but government strategy and media attention have inevitably skewed the picture drastically. Even after lockdown has eased, most continue to see the risk of increased deaths from COVID as a more serious threat than any other. When the UK transitioned to the stay alert strategy, the government was asking people to exercise far greater personal autonomy based on their individual risk profile. Communicating this has been a huge challenge. As Cass Sunstein shows in his new book, Too Much Information, government should really focus on conveying information in a way that best serve overall human well-being. At the very basic level, we should not have been stressing social distancing. I much prefer the phrase physical distancing to allow the fact that we want physical distance at all times, but social togetherness, where we as a country come together. Listening to the radio waves, it seems that confusion and frustration increases with each new announcement of lockdown rules. A more effective public campaign might involve getting people to think pro-socially about the implications of their actions, rather than laying out the precise details of the latest set of rules. Things like "Don't kill Granny" may be negative, but they are a very powerful message. It's hard to see how encouraging people to snitch on their neighbours can help build up social capital. And while the jury is out on Sweden's lockdown strategy, it seems less beset by behavioural and communication issues arising from top-down lockdown rules. For example, the contrast between these two newspaper headlines, published just one day apart, neatly summarises the conflicting tensions of the UK-type approach. Should we be worrying about extensive new lockdowns, or get back to work, or risk losing our job? Right. Now, let's think about the implications in the Union. Scotland, the real story in Scotland. Scotland, this shows you their excess death toll. It's actually much the same as England and significantly above that of similar countries. Yet, look at this. If we look at the approval ratings between the UK's Prime Minister and Nicola Sturgeon, that's very dramatic in terms of people's perceptions. They perceive that Nicola Sturgeon managed the crisis much, much better than our Prime Minister. And that in turn has fed across to approval ratings for the Scottish Government versus the UK Government. Optics matter. And indeed, I have some sympathy here. The UK Government, empowered to make many of the key decisions facing the country, was always going to find itself bearing the brunt of public criticism. As it has in the past, the SNP gained leverage from claiming success when things go well, while blaming the UK government for failures. Now, I fear that I've pointed to too many grey clouds and not enough silver linings. We have a good example of clear political leadership in the UK from the Chancellor, Rishi Sunak. He accepted the advice of economic advisors that unprecedented action was needed. The furlough scheme was put together quickly and has largely achieved its objective of keeping people attached to their employer. The scheme supported a colossal 9.6 million jobs, and this will allow many of them to get back to employment. Of course, there'll be many now facing unemployment as the government exits the furlough strategy, and we will need to learn from past programs as well as from programs put in place by other countries. I think today's announcements by the Chancellor are a step in the right direction. They are much less generous than before, but I feel they help somewhat, and crucially, I think they're flexible enough so that if things turn out a lot worse, they can be amended to provide more help. The Chancellor's leadership at the early stages of the crisis has been buoyed up because his measures propped up the whole economy, so the distributional effects were second order. Now is the time to move to more detailed policies, to think about more targeted policy. And again, for that, you need a proper framework built around subjective wellbeing measures. I also stress that the best thing the government can do for the business community now is to get a Brexit deal, and so avoid the perfect storm of no deal and a second wave of COVID. So, next part, institutions that can implement decisions. When I became Cabinet Secretary way back in 2005, I instituted a series of capability reviews of departments. These examined their strengths and weaknesses using external assessors. The results were published with action plans to improve on weak areas. Alas, they didn't survive beyond my time, being replaced first by departmental improvement plans, and then they've been eclipsed by the challenges brought about by Brexit. When the crisis struck, a lot of the burden fell on Public Health England, and indeed there have been political attempts to blame it for our sad COVID response. PHE was established in 2013 as part of the Lansley reforms. It's an executive agency reporting to the Department for Health and Social Care. It has operational autonomy, but ministers specify its objectives in annual remit letters. It focuses on the behavioural work on prevention, which includes strategies to help us eat better and exercise more. Since containing the pandemic is achieved until we've got a vaccine and better treatments, mostly by changing behaviour, PHE should have played a key role in the response. Now we're at a situation where ministers have announced that it is to be abolished, with a new National Institute for Health Protection being set up in spring 2011, which will be the home to the NHS Test and Trace team and the Joint Biosecurity Centre. The behavioural work, which is arguably the most important part, will go somewhere else, as yet unspecified. This impulse goes firmly against the collaborative human science approach I've been advocating for this lecture. And I might add, one of the things I'm rather proud of, that I think the Cameron-Clegg coalition government should be proud of, was setting up the behavioural insight team inside the Government Office, led by the excellent David Halpern. Since I left, they have now gone outside government. They're advising places like Australia, around the world. They're renowned for their excellence. But they should be, I would say now, spending all their time helping government on this COVID exercise. They are so good. At this stage, it's impossible to reach firm conclusions about which parts of the government machine are responsible for the various operational failures. On the testing side, it's hard to understand why PHE rejected the use of non-government laboratories. Other countries, like South Korea and Germany, successfully used a much more decentralized approach to testing and tracing. In addition to some operational failings, ministers have frequently broken one of the cardinal rules. They have overpromised and underdelivered. Talk of moonshots shows they've not learnt this lesson yet. That puts enormous pressure on the system and results in behaviours which basically, to use a phrase, hit the target but miss the point. I think the whole 100,000 testing episode bears that out. And it's not clear to me that abolishing PHE makes much sense. Does the government not like the executive agency model? That can't be the reason, as the new body they're setting up will have exactly the same status. There are good examples of bodies that are set objectives by government and then given operational autonomy to deliver them, not least the Bank of England. It's much more likely that the problem lies in how a central authority liaises with multiple local and private providers. In addition, perhaps too much faith was put in digital solutions, led out of the newly established NHSX, without realizing the efficacy of low-tech tracing. Clearly, we'll need both people and technology, but it's telling that it's 2020. We have a track and trace system, but at least until today, no app. Of course, we shouldn't forget, talking about failures, that there are also many departmental success stories. I've noted that the Treasury and HMRC's furlough scheme. Over at DWP, Department for Work and Pensions, by April, 4.2 million people were in receipt of universal credit, a rise of 1.2 million cases in the course of a month. When I look back at my now very dated capability reviews, it doesn't surprise me that it's departments like these that have done well. Over the years, the need to respond to major policy changes, usually made in budgets, has required them to be good at implementing changes very quickly and effectively. So, challenges and opportunities ahead. Winter is indeed coming. There's been a lot of debate about the long-term societal changes that might result from this crisis. Some learning has clearly taken place during lockdown, and that has formed new behaviours and modes of human cooperation. As policymakers, we need to study these intently. But if and when a successful vaccine is found and rolled out, how many of these changes will stick? I really hope a lot of them will, to do particularly with our behaviours with respect to improving the climate. But I fear a return to the status quo ante in most cases. So clearly there's a place for government to play a role in guiding the recovery and to make sure that we build back better. Recently, I had the honour of launching the Law Family Commission on Civil, aimed at generating new approaches to make the most of UK civil society. The need for such thinking is clear, and there appears to be appetite in government too, with a more limited government review released today by the excellent Danny Kruger at the request of the Prime Minister. I hope that the government takes his report, and in due course ours, seriously in the context of both the building back and the levelling up agendas. So mapping civil society and building social capital serve both our longer term, but also our immediate interests as a nation. As winter approaches, the challenge will be to prepare for the possibility of an upsurge in coronavirus, a downturn in the economy, and the fallout of a no-deal Brexit. Without adequate preparation, these events, yet again, hold the potential to fall hardest on those who can least afford it. And the wellbeing data will give us a good indicator of that. As it has already, the social sector will play a vital part in mitigating hardship. It's home to a mine of data about local communities, which remains woefully absent in central government understandings about social and civic ties, including the role they served during the lockdown. Making better use of highly decentralized and implicit civic data brings us to the opposite issue, cases where the UK's centralized form of government has not allowed us to reap the touted benefits of centrally pooled data. This should have brought advantages to our early understanding of the pandemic, but it remains uncertain where, in fact, the centralization has helped. Germany, for example, a country that's so far been very successful in combating the pandemic, has a healthcare system with many decentralized features, such as town hospitals, often controlled by local mayors, and a regionally empowered laboratory infrastructure. This is not to say that regionalization and decentralization will always be an asset. At the other extreme, Spain, whose regions have 10 times the health budget of the central government and whose national health ministry has only 500 staff, shows how federalization can cause serious problems for pandemic responses. And here it feels appropriate to mention the UK's own political makeup. The tensions between, for example, Westminster and Holyrood mean that decentralization has become a byword for political discord. Looking from Spain to the United States to Brazil, it seems unavoidable that working through our own various political divisions as a union of nations is part and parcel of any agenda to build back better. We should cast aside ideas of British exceptionalism and look to the likes of New Zealand, Singapore, and South Korea on how we can do things better. So finally, as I deliver this lecture, parts of the world are facing record upticks in daily coronavirus infections. Even more than in 2008, it is clear that our fortunes are bound up with those of the global community. But unlike 2008, the G20 and the G7 currently lack the wherewithal to provide leadership on the cross-cutting issues brought about by this pandemic. There is perhaps no more fitting contrast than that shown in this slide. On the left, this is London's Excel Centre. On the left, showing Gordon Brown, ahead of the G20 conference, which was amazingly successful, stopping the world falling into protectionism, getting them to work together. On the right, that I fear to say largely unused Nightingale Hospital, which it is today. But the point really is about global institutions. At that time, we had the IMF, a strong institution to help with the economy. It's not clear that WHO has the capacity, has the legitimacy or expertise to deal with the attendant non-medical issues that this lecture has paid attention to, and it can't be helped by having the US withdraw its support for it. The need for global government reform that allows for better engagement between the various branches of scientific knowledge is palpable. But to be honest, do I expect anything much to happen? Probably not until after the US election, and then we shall see. The virus will not wait, unfortunately, for the right global leaders to emerge, and so neither should we. In this lecture, I provided a fairly humbling assessment of our record so far. It's imperative to look back critically at where things went wrong, but there's also reason to be optimistic about our ability to confront the next challenges better. In particular, the UK is home to one of the world's most promising vaccine developments. Yet, as I've been at pains to explain in this lecture, it's not just the medical sciences that will be key in tackling the next stages of the pandemic. Analysts have alerted us to the various ancillary challenges that come with the rollout of any vaccine. Manufacturing and storage capacity, as well as transport infrastructure. These challenges will best be dealt with concurrently with questions like who will get the vaccine first, who will pay, and who will profit? How do we ensure high take-up of an approved vaccine while also conforming to our values as a liberal democracy? Having a vaccine is not vaccination. Building public trust domestically and globally will be vital. 40 years ago, the UK played a key role in the genesis of the field of medical ethics. Today, we host an array of institutions that are contributing to similar debates around the development of artificial intelligence. It seems to me that one highly plausible explanation of the British experience of the last 7 or so months, political deference to the medical rather than the broader human sciences, can be recalibrated for the next stage of the pandemic response. This will allow for more productive engagement between the various branches of science, as well as attention to the core social and ethical issues at stake. In sum, the landscape of British scientific endeavour and the liberal democratic values that its institutions hold themselves to are both vital national assets. This may well position the UK to provide a positive contribution to this global challenge. Thank you. Over to you, Paul.
Well, thank you ever so much, Gus. As you would expect from Gus, that was a tour de force covering all the things we know that he has focused on through his life. So a focus on the use of evidence, but not just a focus on the use of evidence, a focus on the delivery of policy, a focus on political leadership, and a focus, of course, on the importance of well-being, all of which should surely be playing a role in the government response. Now, as you'd expect, we've got a huge number of questions here. Gus, I'm actually going to warn you about the last question I'm going to ask you, which is the most popular one here. I'm not going to ask you yet, but I'm warning you, I'm going to ask you, what should your top piece of advice to the current Cabinet Secretary be in how to handle this situation? But before we go on to that, I'll take a few more. There's one that I think is quite important, which you addressed, but I think is important if your message is going to get through to policymakers, which is essentially, this is a health crisis. Surely medical advice trumps everything else, even economics. And as the questioner puts it, and the other social sciences aren't scientific enough anyway. I think actually it's worth pressing you on that, Gus, because I think that is that point about the medical advice trumping everything else is probably the instinctive response, I would guess, of a majority of the population and probably of politicians. I mean, how do you respond to that directly?
Well, I think the key point here is to remember the nature of this crisis. I'm not saying that we don't need the medical advice. We do. We need to understand that. And the medics will tell us about how the virus is spreading. They'll look at treatments, they'll look at vaccines and all the rest of it. But when you think about how we're going to, the measures we're using to stop the spread of the virus now, and in this interim period before we've got treatments or vaccines, these are all measures aimed at changing human behavior. Right? Now, I think the behavioral sciences are absolutely crucial to this. So, for example, if we want to encourage people to wash their hands, it's not going to have much economic cost, but it's a very, very important part, the medics tell us, of reducing the spread of the vaccine. So sometimes the medics can tell you what you need to do, but then we have to get to the question of, well, how do you convince people to do it? And I think some of the messaging about, singing happy birthday twice, about how to spend enough time are absolutely vital. So it's the combination of the sciences I'm trying to get across. I'm not trying to play down the medics. They're absolutely crucial, but they are absolutely necessary, but not sufficient.
Okay, I wouldn't. I certainly wouldn't argue with that. Another question here on a different topic. You referred, Gus, to an eventual inquiry. I don't know whether you think there really will be one, whether there really should be one. This is a question here. And if there is one, what sort of inquiry it should be, and to what purpose there would be to such an inquiry.
Right, yeah, I'm not a fan of huge inquiries that are become very legally focused. I think the purpose of the inquiry, any inquiry there is, should be absolutely clear. It's to learn the lessons so that we're better prepared for the next crisis. Now, I think the risks with inquiries is they become blame exercises, and they become very political. They're trying, one party trying to blame the other party for their failures. I think the important thing is that we learn, why didn't we have enough stocks of PPE there? I think there were quite a lot when I left. What are the things that we got wrong, and so what can we set up for the future? I think also I'd stress, when I look at these inquiries, I think we should be thinking about an inquiry which looks at our capacity to deal with crises, not necessarily the last crisis. I think one of our mistakes is always to try and fight the last war. I'm interested in why, given that pandemics were at the top of the risk register for such a long time, and that we had tabletop exercises and like, we didn't follow through on the lessons that came out of those. So if your top risk is, say, a cyber virus rather than a coronavirus, you want to be clear to make sure that there's a mechanism in government that not only identifies what the key risks are, but make sure that you undertake the actions that are necessary for it, and you keep them. I know in that health area and the work I knew about, you can do some contingencies, but actually, as time goes on, as the health budget is running hot and there's very little spare money, it's very hard to put aside resources which you hope will never be used for contingencies. That's always difficult, and it's always going to be very tempting to raid such pots. So finding structural ways to keep aside contingencies, to think of them as, if you like, insurance policies, but are backed by real resources, is a very tough challenge. And I think learning those sorts of lessons will be really important. I think the last thing we want is anything which goes into the blame game.
Yeah, that sounds like a really difficult exam question, the right one, but a really difficult one for any future inquiry to answer. And it sounds like you're talking about something rather different than a normal judge-led inquiry, rather something which is really going to get to the heart of how Whitehall and beyond responds. We've had another question here, something you referred to, which is really about the centralisation as opposed to decentralisation of decision making. You talked about the potential advantages that a centralised NHS might have, but also some of the disadvantages of centralisation. I mean, would we be better off with a more decentralised governance and a different balance between local and central government in dealing with crises of this kind?
Well, I think my general answer is the UK as a country is a highly centralised country, and I would generally take the view that we should be more decentralised in our revenue collection, as it were. More money at the local level, and there've been lots of reviews you will know about, Paul, that have mostly been rejected in the end by ministers to try and push us in that direction. In terms of the nature for crises of this kind, I would say it's a neat combination. You need to be able to look at the collective set of data where you've got issues where you need very large sample sizes, because actually, for example, now in certain cases, the number of cases, certain areas, the number of cases is very small, the number of deaths is very small. So you can't really infer a great deal if you're looking at relatively small areas. So you need that national database to actually do some serious work. On the other hand, understanding how communities operate and can help each other, and are they looking after neighbours, and its specific actions of particular lockdown decisions on, for example, areas which have multiple generations living in the same house, some areas where the need for food banks is much higher. You need local and community evidence. So it's a combination of the two. It's never one or the other. That's why it's quite a subtle point, and it needs quite careful handling. We need some national data, but we also need the responses from the community to be able to tell you what's really important for that community.
Well, I'll move on to, this is very wide-ranging questions, not surprisingly given the wide-ranging nature of your lecture, Gus. There's a question here, there's two questions I'll put together. One is saying essentially, can we make any judgments at the moment while COVID is still around? But I'll link that actually to a question asking whether we can learn from the outlier nations like Sweden or China, but I think particularly Sweden in terms of how they've dealt with COVID thus far. Because I think if we were making this judgment 3 or 4 months ago, we might have thought that Sweden was a disaster, but it's not so obvious that it is now. So can we learn from those outlier nations, and are we perhaps rushing too quickly to judgment at the moment?
Right. And I think these are really important questions, and that's why at the start I said, when I looked at what are we doing badly, if you look at those numbers on excess debts, on the economy, and on well-being, it's quite clear we do very badly on all of those. Now, if we've done well on one of them and not so well on the others, you might think, well, politicians have made a different trade-off in our country compared to others. But the fact that we're doing badly on all of them suggests that, yes, we do have quite a lot to learn from different countries, but it might be different things from different countries. I think some of the things that countries like Singapore and South Korea did very early on in terms of testing and tracing, some of the things they didn't do, like closing schools, were quite important lessons for us. How much they are driven by the different cultures of those places and acceptance of those things, I think is important. And I think on that question you added as well about, is it too early to make any judgments? I think any judgment we have now has to be very provisional. But if you look at what's happened so far and that weight of evidence across health, economic and well-being data, you have to ask yourself, there's something going wrong. And if we are to manage this crisis better, I think we need to start trying, and it's difficult, to learn lessons from the first part to make sure that the second part, which we're now clearly going into, is managed a bit better.
Okay, we've got 2 minutes to go, so I'm going to return to that question I warned you about at the beginning, which is what would your top piece of advice be to the current Cabinet Secretary, given where we are, in how to handle the situation going forward?
Well, my first thoughts with Simon Case, as the new Cabinet Secretary, would be to say, good luck. You have inherited an incredibly difficult set of tasks. You've got COVID, which is bigger than any health crisis I had to deal with. You've got Brexit, which spans all the departments. My advice to Simon, who is an excellent civil servant, who's had experience of working in the centre, who's very good listener, who's got a good background in constitutional issues, which I think will help him through this, is don't be scared to talk truth unto power. Be mindful always of the evidence. Try and win the intellectual arguments. There are advisors around the Prime Minister who say they're very, very much into data and analytics. That's fantastic news for a Cabinet Secretary. So get the evidence, show what's best, try and create the best possible evidence base for ministers to make their decisions, and then do your very best to get the machine to operate effectively to deliver the decisions made by politicians. And in that sense, he needs to reach out and get the civil service with him. And the message to ministers, I would say, is that what's important, you've got civil servants like the National Health Service and others who've done amazing jobs during this pandemic period. We should be clapping them all. They are not earning huge salaries. Right? These are people who are unsung heroes. And the sooner that Simon and the Prime Minister and all other ministers start saying, congratulations, and yes, it hasn't been perfect, and yes, we need to do better, but we should all work together in this to come up with better outcomes.
Well, that's a very positive thought, I think, to conclude on, and I think we do all want to thank those who have done so much over the period of this crisis. But for now, I will just thank you, Gus, for a fantastic lecture, wide-ranging, thoughtful, and obviously great because I agreed with it. It remains for me to say thank you to everyone who's been watching and listening. Hopefully next year we will be back in person for the annual lecture. But in the meantime, the IFS is putting out an enormous amount of research, both related to COVID and across the whole range of public policy things that we work on. So do keep in touch with us, follow us, look at our website, and do be in touch with us if you would like to be. Thank you again to Gus. Thank you to Greg and everyone at the IFS who helped put this on. And good night to all of you. Stay well and hope to see you soon. Thank you.